The game of Catan has been sold over 40 million times. But how was a game created by a dentist and inspired by Vikings voted the best game of the century? Well, let's start at the beginning. The 20th century was a good time for games, nay, a phenomenal time. While for a good part of history, games had been dismissed as childish, a cultural shift began to take place. For starters, arguably the most influential modern board game, Monopoly was released in 1935. This game, which we all know and love, was actually created in 1903 by a woman named Elizabeth Magie. Magie created this game as a means to critique the business practices of the Gilded Age, where monopolies were dominating the economy. Magie wanted to show how, over time, money would tend to accumulate in the hands of a few, or, in Monopoly's case, of one. But politics aside, in 1938, as a sort of response to evolutionary biology and social Darwinism, Johann Huizinga released the now legendary book, Homo Ludens. In his book, this Dutch psychiatrist argues that, in attempting to reduce humanity to the label of Homo sapiens, science had left out a crucial part of being a human, playing. I know you might be wondering what all of this has to do with Catan, but it will all make sense in a second. Huizinga claimed that constructing worlds governed by a different set of rules was an integral part of the human experience. Now, perhaps due to the dense nature of the text, it was by no means an immediate hit. However, Huizinga's book planted a seed which would germinate over time. As the Second World War ended and people had time to even think about games again, the cultural phenomenon that Huizinga started continued to take shape. After famously finding his brilliant, creative idea during his time at Princeton, in 1950, John Nash published Non-Cooperative Games. As you may have seen in the hit movie A Beautiful Mind, this dissertation started his work on game theory, which would eventually get him a Nobel Prize. Now, why am I telling you about all these snobby academics? Well, because for some reason, games seem to be becoming more important both to scholars and to regular folks. And it would all influence the appearance and popularity of our beloved Catan. Notably, in 1954, the game Tactics was released, and perhaps most famously, in 1957, Risk was released in France, only to be published 2 years later in the US. So, up until this point, we have an increased focus on games from a philosophical standpoint, an economic lens, and a consumer perspective. Enter Claus Teuber. Our protagonist was born in the midst of this in 1952.
There's a lot of similarities between Monopoly and Settler.
Perhaps the trading, When I realized that in my youth, we never trade. When we played Monopoly, and then when I played as Swiss master of Monopoly, we trade a lot.
Teuber was born in a village in Western Germany, and as a child he played with soldier figurines and was obsessed with geography as he enjoyed making maps. The passion for games of this legendary game designer started in his early days. Teuber claimed to have received the board game Romans vs. Carthaginians at age 11. Which, if he was speaking about the 1975 game Rome vs. Carthage, it seems implausible given the dates don't match, but we'll give Claus the benefit of the doubt. Either way, it is clear that from an early age, young Claus was influenced by the increased attention strategy war games were garnering, and this would all contribute to the later creation of Catan. It seems that after his early board gaming experience, he wouldn't return to games until after his military service. And by then, he saw himself forced to join his father's dental laboratory business. That's a mouthful.
I led a dental laboratory. Developing games was a little bit refuge for me.
However, even while working infinite hours in his dental profession, Teuber would find a way for games to come back to his life as what he would call a quote-unquote mental vacation. As he read fantasy stories and novels, Teuber had a yearning to bring these stories to life in the forms of games where he could continue inhabiting the worlds that fascinated him. Sounds a little like a certain Dutch psychiatrist we know. So, in the early 1980s, Teuber began designing his very first game, Barbarossa. Inspired by the novel trilogy The Riddle Master, in this game, players make sculptures out of modeling clay and try to guess what each sculpture represents. Eventually, Teuber showed Barbarossa to a publisher and it was made public in 1988. And that very year, it received one of the most honorary titles a game can receive, the Spiel des Jahres. And if for some reason you aren't fluent in German, that means Game of the Year.
Wie auch immer. Die tragende Idee für mein erstes Spiel war geboren.
Now, to understand what this title means and represents, we need to zoom out for a second. Spiel des Jahres was founded in 1979 with the main purpose of supporting board games created in the German language. However, Spiel des Jahres has famously never given its first prize to a traditional war game of the sort that were prevalent in this time period. So, many scholars have claimed that this was a response to the years of war that impacted Germany. Also, it would seem that German game designers found games like Monopoly or Risk to be too, quote-unquote, one-dimensional. So, here's where it all comes together. Games did not have to exist as an economics lesson or a reenactment of a certain war, but they could be played for their own sake, and in the process explore all sorts of dimensions of the human experience. Claus Teuber would actually echo this philosophy throughout his career.
A very peaceful game with a lot of interaction, bringing people together. For me, Catan was a success.
For instance, it later claimed that one of his games was quote-unquote too competitive, and he seemed to be the most proud of Catan's cooperative and social elements. But I'm getting ahead of myself. After Barbarossa, Teuber published 2 more games before finally releasing Catan, Hoity Toity and Drunter und Drüber, both of which actually won the Spiel des Jahres. But one day, after reading about Iceland, the Virgin Island, and the Viking Age, Teuber was inspired to explore what that world would look like in a game. And it was this inspiration that would change the history of board games irreversibly.
The story of the Vikings inspired me. I imagine how they reach Iceland. They need wood, they need houses and all the things. And so on this imagination, I developed Catan.
Our protagonist tinkered with a settling island game for years. Still a dentist, he used all of his free time to make variations on the game and test it on his wife and children. Perhaps the biggest game changer for Teuber was when he stopped using square tiles and decided to use the now iconic hexagons instead. Teuber had done it again, and he named his fictional island Catan. As you probably know, Catan is a social strategy game. Players act as settlers, gathering resources like wood, brick, sheep, wheat, and ore to build roads, settlements, and cities, and buy development cards. The island of Catan is made up of hexagonal tiles, with resource production determined by dice rolls. Players can then trade these resources with other players, the bank, or steal from each other to accumulate points. Die Siedler von Catan, its original name, instantly became popular in Germany in 1995 and, of course, won the Game of the Year. Spiel des Jahres games had infiltrated the US in certain niche groups, but this time Catan became a widespread phenomenon. In fact, it sort of became the entry point for Americans to start playing Euro games, which are games characterized by the sort of player interaction and strategy components we've discussed. These games mostly originate from Europe and, most prominently, Germany. Everyone from football players to college students to professors began to play Catan. It even became a hit in Silicon Valley, where people like Mark Zuckerberg or the CEO of Zynga would play with their employees. Since then, Catan has inspired documentaries, series of novels, it has been mentioned in shows like Big Bang Theory or South Park, and tens of versions have been created. You might have heard of Citizen Knights, Seafarers, or Traders and Barbarians. Or maybe you've heard of the Star Trek version, or the Game of Thrones one, or perhaps the Ancient Egypt adaptation. You get the point. There are many of these. In fact, there's well over 50 versions of Catan, which together have sold over 40 million copies. That's more than Zelda, Skyrim, or even Call of Duty. But besides becoming a household name, Catan has created a thriving competitive scene. Every year, over 40 countries hold national tournaments, and the highest ranked players compete in the Catan World Championship. Online alternatives to Catan have also flourished, with Colonist.io being the biggest one. Especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, the online Catan scene grew dramatically, with tournaments and leagues appearing, and YouTube personalities like Delighted or Dandy Drew becoming pillars of the community. In their videos, these creators post gameplays, lessons, or even mini documentaries of their time through certain tournaments. The future of Catan most likely includes its competitive scene becoming more prominent as players dive deeper into the strategic elements of the game. Unfortunately, Claus Teuber passed away in April 2023, but he left us with a legacy that highlights humanity's essential love for play, and one that will last for generations.